Hey guys, what's up? My name is Skyweb and I'm here to talk about a true crime story that I cannot get off my mind. Before I start, I just want to put out a little disclaimer that I mean no disrespect to any of the victims or the victim's family and anyone who was harmed. In these events, I wish nothing but the utmost peace and solace in rest or in recovery. Everything that I talk about today has been gathered from all across the web and is purely for educational purposes. Now that that's out of the way, my favourite scary or scary-ish movie has always been Scream, up until a couple of days ago when I discovered that Scream is actually based off a real-life event. So the infamous Woodsboro murderer was actually a real-life serial killer, and he was nicknamed the Gainesville Ripper. Creepy. The Gainesville Ripper garnered a lot of attention after he killed 5 students over the course of 4 days in 1990. He instilled so much fear into the community with the help of the media who covered the story pretty intensively. They shared a lot of the gruesome details of the murders within those 4 days, which sent everyone in the town into a frenzy basically. There were families staying at hotels because they felt safer. There were students transferring to different schools because they didn't feel safe where they were. And there were even groups of friends staying in one... Where is my voice? There was even groups of friends staying in one apartment out of fear of being on their own. Everyone was terrified. Police pretty much immediately knew they had a serial killer on their hands due to the nature of the crimes, and they instantly feared that there would be more crimes to come. But what they didn't suspect was how fast the murders would be committed. The police felt like they were always a step behind during these murders. They felt as though the killer always had a one-up on them, and it even got to the point where they weren't sure whether it was a copycat killer, whether it was one killer. They weren't sure if they had their motive misconstrued, and they were so conflicted that they even held a suspect for longer than the legally permitted time frame because they were so sure that he was the killer, and he wasn't. Police did eventually catch the Gainesville Ripper, but I'll get into that a little bit later. For now, I'm going to tell you how the murders were committed. A little disclaimer, there is sexual assault in these stories as well as being fairly gruesome. There's also mutilation to the body, so if you don't want to hear any of that, I suggest you click off. The first murders committed by the Gainesville Ripper occurred in the early morning hours of Friday 24th of August 1990. His victims are 17-year-old freshman Sonja Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell. Killer had broken into their apartment using a screwdriver to sort of jimmy the lock of a sliding glass door. As well as being armed with a screwdriver, he was also armed with a Marine Corps K-bar knife, which later led police to believe that he may have had military training, as they could tell what kind of knife he was using due to the wounds he left behind in the victims. After breaking in, the killer came across Christina first, and she was asleep on the downstairs couch. So the killer actually stopped for a moment and watched her sleep. He then decided that he would go upstairs to where Sonja Larson was also asleep in her bed. When he reached Sonja, he stabbed her once in the chest before then duct taping her mouth to muffle her screams. He then continued to stab her in the chest, the stomach, the arms, even in the thighs. She quickly died after that due to her wounds. And once he was finished with her, he went downstairs back to Christina, who was still asleep on the couch. He duct taped her mouth just like he did with Sonja, though this time he also duct taped her hands behind her back so that she couldn't struggle. He then took his knife and sliced her clothes off, removing them from her body. He then threatened her with the knife and violently sexually assaulted her. When he was finished doing that, he placed her face down on her stomach, and then he stabbed her 5 times in the back, which ultimately killed her. Christina Powell's body was also mutilated. He actually had cut off her nipples and he took them with him, so police assumed that he was taking them as some sort of prize or some sort of trophy to say, look what I've done, you know, take something away from the crime that he had committed, because he was proud of it. And when the murderer was on trial and this murder came up, the jury was actually instructed to ignore the fact that her nipples had been cut off. When they passed a photo around of the dead body, they had actually blacked out the wounds where the nipples had been cut off, and they were all instructed not to consider it when making their decision, which I think is crazy. It makes sense for the fact that it did occur after death. It wasn't a contributing factor in her murder necessarily, but I think it's something that would be fairly hard to ignore, the fact that he had mutilated her body like that. He then left both bodies in sexually promiscuous positions. He did this to humiliate the bodies. He put them on their hands and knees with their behinds in the air. And police came to the conclusion that he was doing this as a way to humiliate them and show off what he had done. The killer also showered before leaving, but he did manage to leave behind some DNA. He left semen in Christina's underwear next to her dead body, as well as leaving some in paper towels in the kitchen. He also removed the duct tape from both girls and took that with him, as well as taking Christina's nipples with him. Immediately, police assumed that they had a serial killer on their hands due to the nature of the crimes, and due to the fact that they felt he enjoyed what he was doing. The police feared that he would strike again, though at this point they had no idea how quickly he would murder again. Approximately 42 hours later, in the evening hours of Saturday, the 25th of August 1990, he broke into the apartment of Christa Hoyt. Again, the killer entered through glass doors after jamming the lock with a screwdriver, but unlike the first two murders, this time Christa wasn't home. The murderer actually had to wait in her apartment for her to arrive home, and this led police to believe that the murderer had actually stalked Christa beforehand. They assumed that he had stalked her beforehand and handpicked her to be a victim of his attacks. Police weren't sure whether this had been the case for the first two girls, as the first two girls did have a third roommate who was absent at the time of the murders. So this time it was a little bit different, where they had more evidence to believe that he had handpicked this girl, whereas they didn't have that sort of evidence for the first two murders. When Christa arrived home, the attacker placed her in a chokehold, surprising her from behind, and dragged her from the living room to a bedroom. He then duct taped her mouth and her hands and cut her clothes off before sexually assaulting her. After the sexual assault was finished, he placed her on her stomach and stabbed her in the back 3 times. Christa was actually reported missing not long after the murder, and when police arrived to her house to check on her, they didn't get a response. So they knocked on her door, they checked around the premises, and they even called out to her a couple of times. Instead of just leaving the scene, police officers actually discovered that her blinds were a little bit askew in the corner of her sliding glass doors, so that if they got on their hands and knees, they could actually see through the doors to see if anyone was home. So a police officer did get down on his hands and knees and peeked through the gap in the window and discovered her dead body. And when police officers entered the premises, they discovered that, just like the first two murders, Christa had been positioned in a fairly humiliating way. She was positioned so that she was sitting up, slumped over on the end of her bed, and sitting across from her on her bookshelf was actually her head. Her head had been positioned to stare at her dead body. This time, the mutilation had been taken to the next level. As well as beheading her, he also cut off her nipples. This time though, he left the nipples sitting next to her body on the bed. So unlike the first murders where police assumed he had taken it as a trophy, this time they were sort of stumped as to why he would leave them. Now they were left to question whether or not this was the same killer. They assumed it might have been a copycat killer because those details had been shared on the news in the large amount of media coverage, and they were worried that maybe they had a copycat killer on their hands because they couldn't understand why he would take one set and not the second. They also feared that if this was the same killer and he had upped the ante for this murder, what would he do next in order to seek a bigger high? And just like in the first murders, during the trial, the jurors were instructed not to take the decapitation into consideration, which again is just crazy. How could you not consider the fact that someone had been decapitated? It did occur after her death, which is why they were instructed not to consider it, but it just seems nuts to me. So now police were confused. They had a lot of conflicting evidence, but the one thing that came out of this that they felt was a positive is that now they could identify a pattern between victims. All the victims were female, all the victims were students, all the victims were petite, and all the victims had brown hair. They felt they were onto something. Only a day later and the killer struck again. He broke into another apartment, this time the apartment of Tracy Powell and Manny Taboada. Again, he broke in through sliding glass doors using a screwdriver, and again he was armed with the same Marine Corps K-bar knife. This time he went straight into Manny's room, where he stabbed him first in the stomach, which wounded him fairly greatly. Manny actually woke up and tried to defend himself. He tried to get away from the attacker, and the struggle was said to have been quite full on, quite brutal. Manny was a fit kid. He was strong, he wasn't weak by any means, and he fought for his life. But unfortunately, the killer didn't give up. The killer stabbed him in the chest, the stomach, the arms, the legs, even the hands and the face, which I think goes to show if you're being stabbed in the hands, you're really trying to defend yourself. And Tracy, Manny's roommate, actually woke up from the commotion of this attack, and she snuck into Manny's room where she saw the killer. She caught a glimpse of him covered in Manny's blood and ran for her life. She tried to lock her door behind her and barricade herself into the room, but unfortunately the Ripper got into the room and attacked her. He taped her mouth shut, he taped her hands behind her back, he cut her clothes off, and he threatened her with the knife where he sexually assaulted her. He cleaned and positioned Tracy's body, though not in the way police suspect he would have wanted to, but he left Manny exactly where he was. And this murder was another thing that seemed inconsistent to police. They thought they had stumbled across his pattern, where it was all females, and now there was a male in the mix, so they didn't know whether it was intentional, whether it was accidental, whether he knew Manny lived there, whether he didn't, whether it was a copycat killer. They were as confused as ever. So one of Manny's friends actually became concerned for his well-being when he couldn't get a hold of him. He contacted a mutual friend of Tracy and Manny, and they were also worried because Tracy, you couldn't get a hold of her either. So both the friends went to see the maintenance officer of the apartment building, and they actually explained the story and got the maintenance officer to let them into the apartment. So the maintenance officer let them in, and all three began to walk into the apartment, where they saw Tracy's dead body sitting in the hallway. It's the first thing they saw, and next to her body was a big black bag covered in blood. So the maintenance officer immediately slammed the door shut, locked the door, and ran to get help, and police arrived only 5 minutes later, which is very fast for police. 5 minutes later, and the police are entering the apartment, but Tracy's body had been moved. It had been positioned on a towel in a different position than what it was in, and the black bag was gone. Police concluded that the killer had actually been interrupted before he had a chance to mutilate her body. They suspect that he wanted to mutilate Tracy's body but had been interrupted, which means that the killer was there only minutes prior to police entering the apartment. Just let that sink in for a minute. 2 college students and a maintenance officer came this close to being face to face with the Gainesville Ripper, the one who was installing fear into the entire town, the one who was attacking college students left, right and center. They came this close to being his next victims, and had they panicked and stayed in frame, had they said, "That's Tracy, where's Manny?" gone into the apartment looking for him, had they had any other reaction other than running and locking the door, they could have been the next victims. He could have claimed more people than he had. So that's probably the most Scream-esque thing I could think of, entering an apartment with the killer still lurking. It's pretty terrifying, I think. So those were the 5 murders committed by the Gainesville Ripper, and they were committed over 4 days. So extremely quickly. Everyone was panicked, everyone was freaking out. They didn't know what was going on. It happened so quick, it hit them out of nowhere, and now they felt like nowhere was safe and no one could be trusted. And police received a lot of calls from the public trying to give assistance and put in tips, and a lot of the tips led to nothing. One tip in particular actually led police to believe that a local teen with a kind of shady criminal past may have been the Gainesville Ripper, and his name continued to pop up. So the first time it popped up was from an elderly lady who actually called in to give them his name. She said he was shady and had done things in the past that made him seem suspicious, and after this his name popped up again, where he was actually thrown out of one of the apartment buildings where the murders were committed for fighting. So police were very suspicious of this young man. Police named him as the main suspect, and his name was heavily slandered throughout the news. Everyone believed that he was the killer. Police actually held him at the station for a lot longer than legally permitted because they tried to build a case around him. They truly felt that he was the killer, and they felt that if they released him, another murder would occur. So they kept him for longer than they should have, trying desperately to get evidence to keep him there. But unfortunately, they couldn't find what they needed because he wasn't the killer. His name is forever tarnished by these events. I'm choosing to leave his name out of this for the fact that I think it's kind of messed up that he's continually involved in this when he didn't do anything wrong. He didn't kill these people. He wasn't involved in these murders. The media really went off on this kid. Everyone thought that he was the killer. So there's plenty of stuff all over the internet about him and about his past crimes. If anyone wants to do their own research and have a look into it, you're more than welcome. But I just don't want to include him in this. I just think it's not fair. But that being said, in the movie Scream, in the first movie, the killer in that movie was actually based off this guy. They actually thought that this guy's face, his attitude, his story, his life, his age all fit the story better than the real killer did, which is kind of fucked up. It's kind of fucked up. But anyway, moving on to the real killer. So the real killer's name is Danny Rollins. Danny Rollins was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, and he lived with his mother and father, his father of which was actually a police officer. Despite being a police officer, he was actually a very abusive father, and not only did he abuse Rollins, he also abused his wife Claudia, which is Rollins' mother. There was lots of instances where he had beat Rollins, where he had abused Rollins, where he had told him he was an embarrassment and he wasn't wanted and he was useless. There was even one time where he had a buddy of his from the police force come over to the house, arrest Rollins, put him in cuffs and take him away for being an embarrassment to his father and to society, which is crazy to me that there were two police officers willing to do this to a child. He was a child at the time. It's nuts. And as well as being abusive to him, he was very abusive to his mother Claudia, and there was also times where Claudia had gone to the police and claimed she was forced to cut herself with razor blades because he had made her. But nothing ever came of it, and every time she left him, she came back. So it was a very traumatic childhood. And he relied on that quite heavily during his trial to try to excuse his actions. So Danny had committed past crimes, a triple homicide back in his hometown in 1989, and he even attempted murder on his father in the same year as the Gainesville Murders. At the time of the murders, he was living in a campsite in town with one of his buddies who used drugs pretty heavily, and his buddy supplied him with drugs as well. And to fund these drugs, they did a lot of robberies together. One robbery in particular, they robbed a bank, but the police caught them and chased them back to their campsite, and they actually found a number of things that would be later used to connect Danny to the murders. But at the time, they thought they had the Gainesville Ripper locked up in custody, so they thought he was nothing but a robber. And their biggest accomplishment was finding a bag of cash covered in pink dye. So they actually took Rollins' possession and stored them in the police lockup, in the evidence locker, and they didn't realize that they had everything they needed to arrest the Ripper right under their noses in their own storage locker. It was insane. So Rollins got away, he ran away, and he did what he knew how to. He committed a string of robberies, he broke into college students' homes, and he stole money. But he didn't get a lot, so he stole a car, and he committed a robbery on a store. But the police were called and the police pursued him, and they actually ended up in a high-speed car chase. So that continued for some time until Danny actually crashed his car. And when he crashed, he got out and ran into the woods. So the police pursued him on foot and finally caught him. They caught the Gainesville Ripper. Once he was in custody, he was actually very forthcoming about his crimes. Police asked him for DNA samples, and it matched the DNA that was left at the crime scenes of the murders. It was then that they discovered his possessions actually connected him to the crimes as well. Once in custody, he was very forthcoming, he was very cooperative, he was very helpful, he was well spoken, he didn't seem quick to anger, he seemed very well in control of himself. That was up until one instance where they sort of saw a different side to him. He became so angry that he actually ripped a toilet seat off of the toilet and threw it at people across the room. It was at this point that his defense attorney actually ordered a psychological test and evaluation, and she suggested that he change his plea from guilty to an insanity plea. It became a matter of the death sentence or a life sentence. So he actually blamed a lot of his actions on his childhood, his father, his mother, his ex-wife, any sort of abuse he endured during his life he used in his defense. But that being said, to the jury's surprise, to the judge's surprise, and to his attorney's surprise, at the very last minute when the trial began, he changed his plea from an insanity plea, which was permitted after he had seen psychologists. They had mixed reports. Some thought he was perfectly sane, others thought there was something more going on. But he actually changed his insanity plea to guilty, and he hadn't told anyone, so it was a big surprise. And it's assumed that he did this as a last-ditch effort to gain control. They thought that the reason he did these murders was to be in control. The reason he tried to humiliate them was to be in control, to get attention. And they thought that the reason that he was so forthcoming with police was to regain some sort of control of his narrative that he didn't have otherwise. His defense truly believed he would have got off the death sentence penalty, but it didn't turn out that way. Danny Rollins was sentenced to death for the horrific murders of Sonja Larson, Christina Powell, Christa Hoyt, Tracy and Manuel Taboada. In 2006, the Gainesville Ripper was put to death by lethal injection. So let me know what you think about this story. What do you think about the fact that this story inspired Scream, and what do you think about his sentencing? Do you think he should have stuck with the insanity plea, or do you think he was right to change it to guilty? And do you believe in the death penalty at all? Because I know most places don't actually have the death penalty like this. I personally dislike the fact that they made such a successful movie, franchise and TV series based on this guy who clearly got so much enjoyment out of the murders. He enjoyed the attention, he enjoyed humiliating them, and I don't feel like those movies are very respectful to the students who passed away, or to the town that was traumatized, or to the families, or any of them really. And it's a shame, because I really liked that movie when I thought that it was fake. I never realized that it was real, so I think that's a real shame. But I want to know what you guys think. How do you feel about it? Are you still gonna support Scream and watch Scream? Do you think it makes a difference? Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm sorry if this story plays on your mind as much as it has mine. I just think it's so horrific, and I don't know, it bugs me, this story, for whatever reason. It really bugs me. Hopefully I'll be able to make some new videos very soon about some other true crime stories. I think they're very interesting, and it's definitely something I enjoy researching and enjoy talking about, so I hope you guys share some feedback, because I would love to hear it. Make sure you subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this. I'm going to post every Thursday, and I'm always up for suggestions, so let me know what you guys want to see. Let me know what true crime stories have freaked you out, and see if you can freak me out too. So stay safe, be careful, lock your doors, and if you have sliding glass doors, get some fucking wood and put it in the thing so that people can't break in with a screwdriver, and have a nice day. Bye.